This is a tutorial about using Judy's magic cast on for a provisional cast on. I've got a circular needle which is in the size that I need to get gauge, and it's very long. I've also got a straight needle that I'm going to use after my provisional cast on because I'll be knitting in the flat, but we'll put that aside for the moment. We've got our yarn, and I've given myself a nice long tail, as long as I would use if I was doing a long tail cast on. To start our provisional cast on, we're going to hold the circular needle in our right hand with the two needles lying parallel to each other. Let's just get a close-up of that. I've got the yarn in my left hand and I'm going to hold it like so between my index finger and thumb, and we're going to just place the yarn between those two needles like so, and that is our first stitch. So we've got our yarn now between the two needles that are being held parallel. We've got an upper strand that is looped over my index finger, and we've got a lower strand that is looped over my thumb. The lower strand creates the stitches for the upper needle, and the upper strand will create the stitches on the lower needle. Our first stitch is placed over the lower needle, and now we need to create a stitch going over the upper needle. To do that, we're going to take our lower strand and pass it between the needles and then over the top of the upper needle like so. I'm just going to place my finger over those stitches to hold it more securely. Now we're going to, with our upper thread, create a stitch on the lower needle. To do that, we wrap the yarn around the needle and then bring it back through the middle of those needles, and we've created a lower stitch. Now we need to create an upper stitch again, so we're going to take our lower yarn, bring it through the middle of those two needles and then over the top like so. So now you can see we've got two upper and two lower stitches. The number of stitches that we need to cast on in our provisional cast on for this pattern is 122. So what I'm going to need is 122 stitches on the upper needle that I'll be working with, and 122 stitches on the lower needle, which we'll keep on the cable and pick up later on. So let's start again with a lower needle stitch. And an upper needle stitch. Lower needle stitch. Upper needle stitch. I'm now going to cast on the remaining 118 stitches. So we've finished casting on our stitches, finishing with a stitch over the upper needle. If you look closely, you'll see that on the back of the knitting, we've got what appear to be purl bumps. So it's important when you're starting to knit to make sure that you're knitting from the right side. For the pattern I'm knitting, it's in stocking stitch, starting with a knit row. So I'm going to turn my work around so that the right side is facing. I'm knitting in the flat, and so I've got a third needle, which is a straight needle, and I'm going to use that to knit my first row. In order to knit the first row, what I'm going to do to make it easier is I'm going to pull the lower needle to the right so that the stitches are now just on the cable, and that gives me a little bit more room to knit the upper stitches. The other thing we want to do is make sure that we don't lose that last stitch. So we're going to do that just by twisting our yarns at the back, making sure that we're knitting with our working yarn. Okay, so we're ready to knit our first row. And we'll just knit all the way along. So I've finished knitting my first row, and what we'll do is we're going to keep our provisional stitches on the cable. I'm just going to keep that needle pulled out so that those stitches don't accidentally fall off. You can just put some cable stoppers on the end of your cable, which would free up your needles on the cable. I'm going to continue knitting in the flat. When it comes time to place these stitches back on the needle, all I need to do is pull my cable needle to the right, pushing those stitches back onto my needle, and then I'd be ready to knit from the bottom again.